The sack lay on the wooden floor between them, heavy and still like it carried a secret that did not want to be touched, and Caleb Hart stood there with his hat in his hands staring at it while the woman across from him hugged her shawl tight around her shoulders. Her voice had been quiet when she spoke, but it carried weight. "Please take them off," she said, and the words echoed inside the small ranch house, louder than any gunshot Caleb had heard in his life. He had seen death storms, hunger, and men breaking under fear, but this moment froze him more than all of that. Outside, the wind dragged dust across the plains, and the sun dipped low, turning the world gold and red, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb was known in the county as a hard man, but a fair one. A widowed rancher who kept to himself and worked the land from dawn until the stars came out. He did not gamble, he did not drink much, and he did not take part in town gossip. People respected him because he minded his own business and helped when help was needed without asking for praise. That was why the sheriff had brought the woman to his door wrapped in a torn shawl with fear in her eyes and a sack tied shut at her feet. The sheriff said she had nowhere else to go, and Caleb had nodded because turning someone away was never his way. Her name was Mara, and she spoke with an accent that marked her as different, though she spoke English well enough. She said little when she arrived, only thanked him softly and followed him inside, like someone expecting the ground to fall out from under her at any moment. Now, hours later, as the fire crackled low, she finally told him why she had come and why the sack mattered. Her hands shook as she pointed at it, and Caleb felt something tighten in his chest because whatever was inside, it scared her more than being alone on a stranger's ranch. He knelt slowly and touched the knot on the sack, hesitating because he understood that opening it meant crossing a line neither of them could uncross. He asked once if she was sure, and she nodded without looking at him, her eyes fixed on the fire as if she needed its warmth to stay standing. Caleb loosened the rope and pulled the cloth back inch by inch until he saw what lay inside, and his breath caught so hard it hurt. It was not gold or weapons or stolen goods. It was proof of cruelty and survival wrapped in blood-stained cloth and memories that should never have been carried by one person alone. Caleb did not speak right away. He closed the sack gently as if it were fragile and sat back on his heels. His hands were steady, but his heart was not. He had seen scars before, but this was different because this was not just about pain. It was about dignity stolen and carried like a burden. Mara finally looked at him and waited for the judgment she expected, because the world had taught her to expect it. Instead, she saw something else in his eyes. Something like anger, not at her, but for her. Something like resolve. He stood and poured her a cup of water and set it in her hands, then sat across from her, leaving space, because he understood that space could be kindness. He told her she was safe here and that whatever she carried was not shameful. He said it plainly without poetry, because truth did not need decoration. Mara's shoulders trembled, and for the first time tears came, not loud or wild, but slow and heavy, as if she had been holding them back for years. Outside, the wind softened and the fire popped, sending sparks upward like small prayers. That night Caleb did not sleep much. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easy it was for people to look away and how hard it was to do the right thing when the right thing brought trouble. He knew the town would talk if they learned what he had taken into his home. He knew men would judge and women would whisper. But he also knew that some lines mattered more than reputation, and that if the world had failed Mara, then he would not be another man who did. When morning came, he cooked breakfast and set another plate at the table, even though she hesitated before sitting. He told her she could stay as long as she needed and that no one would force her to leave. He said work could come later and healing came first. She listened carefully, as if weighing whether to believe him, and finally she nodded once. A small gesture, but one that carried hope like a fragile flame. The sun rose over the plains, bright and steady, and for the first time since she arrived, Mara looked out the window without fear. Neither of them knew then that the sack would change more than their lives, that its contents would stir the town and force truths into the open, that kindness would be tested and love would grow in the cracks left by cruelty. But as Caleb cleared the table and Mara stood by the window, watching the land stretch endless and open, something new settled between them. Not romance, yet not promises. Just trust beginning to breathe. And in the Wild West, that was the bravest thing of all. Morning on the ranch came quiet, but heavy with thought, and Caleb Hart felt the weight of the previous night in every movement he made as he stepped outside and drew in the cool air. The plains stretched endless and calm, yet his mind was restless, because once you saw suffering, you could not unsee it, and once you chose to help, there was no turning back. He split wood slower than usual, his axe striking with steady force, while his thoughts wandered toward the woman inside, and the burden she carried, not just in the sack, but in her silence. Mara woke before he returned, and stood at the doorway, unsure whether she was allowed to step fully into the day. She watched Caleb work from a distance, studying the way he moved with purpose, but without cruelty, as if the land itself trusted him. When he noticed her, he tipped his hat slightly, not as a gesture of authority but of acknowledgement, and she felt something ease inside her chest. She had learned long ago that safety was often an illusion, yet something about this place felt different, grounded and honest, like the man who owned it. They spoke little that morning because words were still fragile between them. Instead, Caleb showed her where the well was and where she could wash if she wished. He told her she did not owe him anything and that she would not be questioned unless she chose to speak. Those words mattered more than he realized, because control had been taken from her so often that having a choice felt almost unreal. Mara nodded and went about small tasks, sweeping the porch, folding the blanket. She had used sleeping carefully, as if she were afraid of leaving traces of herself behind. By midday, dust rose on the road leading toward the ranch, and Caleb knew before he saw them that trouble had arrived. The sound of hooves and a wagon carried too much intent to be harmless. 3 men from town approached, one riding ahead, while the others followed slower, their eyes sharp and curious. Caleb stepped forward to meet them, because protecting something sometimes meant standing alone. The lead rider was Thomas Reed, shopkeeper, with a voice that carried further than his courage, and he did not bother with pleasantries. He said word had reached town that Caleb had taken in a woman found wandering with no papers, no kin, and no explanation. He said people were concerned, because concerned was an easier word than afraid or cruel. He hinted at laws and propriety, and the kind of rules that bent differently depending on who stood before them. Caleb listened without interrupting, and when Thomas finished, Caleb told him simply that the woman was under his roof, and that was enough. He said no law had been broken, and that charity was not a crime. The men exchanged looks, and one laughed softly, but there was unease behind it, because Caleb Hart was not a man to provoke lightly. He had a reputation earned not through violence, but through consistency, and that frightened people more than anger ever could. Thomas warned him that the town would not stay quiet, and Caleb answered that the town had no claim on his conscience. The wagon turned back, eventually leaving dust and tension behind, but Caleb knew this was only the beginning. Mara had watched from the window, and when Caleb returned inside, she apologized, though she did not know why. She said she never meant to bring trouble, and Caleb shook his head firmly, telling her that trouble already existed long before she arrived. He told her that kindness often made noise because it exposed what others ignored. She listened, absorbing every word like someone starving for truth. That afternoon she told him part of her story, not all of it, just enough to explain why running had been her only choice and why the sack could never be abandoned. She spoke of promises broken and hands that took without asking, of power used to silence rather than protect. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes told the truth of nights without sleep and days without hope. Caleb did not interrupt or ask questions. He understood that telling was an act of courage and that listening was a responsibility. When she finished, he thanked her not because politeness demanded it, but because bearing witness mattered. He told her that what happened to her did not define her worth, and that words spoken aloud lost some of their power to wound. As days passed, the ranch settled into a rhythm that included Mara naturally. She helped where she could, learn the routines, and slowly allowed herself to exist without apology. She laughed once when a chicken startled her, and the sound surprised them both because it felt like a door opening. Caleb noticed the change but did not comment. He believed healing worked best when unobserved, like seeds growing beneath the soil. The sack remained hidden but no longer felt like a threat looming in the corner. It was still heavy, but shared weight was lighter. The town, however, did not forget. Whispers followed Caleb when he rode in for supplies. Eyes lingered and voices dropped when he passed. Some spoke of morality, others of fear, but none spoke of compassion. One afternoon, a notice appeared on the board calling for a meeting to discuss safety and order. Caleb knew what it meant. He went anyway because silence would have been easier, but easier was not always right. The meeting was crowded and tense, and when Caleb stood to speak, the room quieted, not out of respect alone, but expectation. He said he had taken in a woman who needed shelter, and that no harm had come of it. He said that fear dressed up as concern still stank of cowardice, and that history would judge how they treated the vulnerable. He did not raise his voice, and he did not accuse by name, yet his words struck deep. Some looked away, others bristled, but a few nodded quietly, and that was enough to matter. The sheriff ended the meeting early, and the town dispersed unsettled, but changed. That night Caleb returned home to find Mara waiting with supper ready. She asked how it went, and he told her the truth, that some battles were loud, and some were fought slowly over time. She thanked him again, and this time he did not deflect it. He told her that staying was her choice, and that leaving would not be failure either. She said she wanted to stay because for the first time she believed tomorrow could be different. They sat together in the fading light, neither speaking, because sometimes shared silence was stronger than vows. Far-off thunder rolled, hinting at storms yet to come. But inside the ranch house there was calm. The sack remained unopened, but its purpose was changing from proof of pain to a symbol of survival. And as the night deepened, Caleb realized that protecting Mara had already changed him. He was no longer just a man working land alone. He was part of something larger, now a story that would not stay buried, no matter how hard others tried. Because truth, like the plains, always found a way to stretch free. The storm that swept across the ranch felt like a final test, loud and unrelenting, yet it passed without destroying what Caleb and Mara had built. By morning, the land was clean and quiet, and so was something inside Mara. The fear she had carried for so long no longer controlled her steps. When news came that the town was ready to face the truth, she understood that the choice ahead belonged only to her. Mara rode into Red Hollow beside Caleb not as someone seeking approval, but as a woman ready to reclaim her voice. She spoke plainly, revealing the truth she had carried in silence for too long. The sack, once a symbol of shame and survival, became proof of cruelty that could no longer be denied. The town listened, not all with courage, but enough to change what came next. Accusations fell apart, and judgment gave way to uneasy understanding. Returning to the ranch, Mara felt lighter than she had in years. She buried the sack beneath the old cottonwood tree, not to forget the past, but to release it. Caleb stood with her, offering presence rather than protection. That gesture mattered most. She had not been saved. She had been respected. Life slowly returned to its rhythm, stronger and more honest. The town did not become perfect, but it became quieter, more careful with its judgments. Apologies came softly. Some stayed away. Mara accepted both without bitterness. As seasons turned, the ranch became a place of steady peace. Caleb and Mara did not rush into promises, but their bond deepened through shared work, trust, and quiet affection. They chose each other daily, not out of fear or debt, but because dignity and kindness had brought them together. Under the wide western sky, their story ended not with outrage, but with resolve. What began in shock and silence closed in truth and choice. And in that choice, they found a future built not on ownership, but on respect, courage, and love that endured because it was freely given.